You were sitting on this movie for a long time, right?
Yeah, we were actually. Yeah.
And so, like, was it just sort of like, did you know more or less like all the plot points like a year or two in advance, or did you just know like the segments you sort of worked on?
No, I actually had a pretty good understanding of the majority of the project. I was lucky enough to be able to kind of go see a couple of the pre-screenings of the movie, just for in like a rougher form. So I kind of had a good idea of what the movie was going to be. Some things changed for the final product, but for the most part, I kind of had an understanding of how it was going to go. Um, so yeah, it was. I was very fortunate that I was able to actually get some screenings of it when I went down to LA to go meet with Marvel a couple times.
Awesome. And so, like, I mean, from the outside looking in, I mean, obviously everyone wants to get inside the minds of Marvel. What is it like from your position, getting to work with like Marvel Studios and like getting to see like what's happening behind the scenes?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a really, really great experience. Luckily, I feel like Marvel is a very well-oiled machine. They have a very tried, tested, and true system that they continue to use on a lot of their movies, and they're a really, really organized group when it comes to getting you the information and the data that you need to be able to create the effects that you need to for them. And just being able to work with them pretty closely on this movie just kind of made me realize, like, how organized and how well thought out a lot of their like movies are from the beginning and are to go to shoot it. And again, everyone over there is really, really a pleasure to work with, and they were always very positive, and they kind of understand the process. So it was really good, and especially for this movie, it was really great that they were able to give us answers and get back to us very quickly in a lot of questions and information that we needed. Because this was actually their shortest post schedule that they actually ever had before COVID happened. Obviously, COVID extended that out a bit, but the original due dates were actually the shortest schedule that they actually had for post production out of any of their movies so far.
Oh, gotcha. So, like, because of COVID, were you allowed to sort of like fine tune a few things, or did you have everything ready to go like way before COVID hit? I guess
Yeah,
the movie was about to hit. So anyway.
what's that?
Sorry, I guess the movie was about to hit when everything started to shut down, like a month or two beforehand, right?
Yeah, so we were pretty much complete on everything by the time that COVID actually hit. We still have a few things that were outstanding that we're still working on, but we would have had those done before the movie came out. But since COVID hit, and everyone had to get settled and working from home, and even the client side of things, and they had to figure out how to review things properly on like a real a theater screen, and in the DN stuff they took it took a bit of time for them to kind of organize that so that they could make sure that they were doing it safely during COVID. So it did give us a little bit more time to finish up a couple of the shots that we kind of had outstanding, and just kind of refine a few things since we had a little bit more time. But for the most part, yeah, we were complete. I would say we were about 99% complete by the time that COVID actually hit and changed things.
Awesome. So, like, I've always been curious because how, like, what's the process sort of like when they sort of ask you for these specific shots, the specific sequences, and like, what's the time frame between like when you're asked to complete something and then usually like you said this was the shortest sort of turnaround, but what's that process typically like?
Yeah, so I mean, usually it really is dependent on the movie. There's been some movies that have been in production for a year to 2 years, but I find that typically a lot of the movies are usually 6 to 8 month post production schedules, and this one was about 5 months, I believe it was, for post production, and so things were it was a little bit of a faster pace, and you really had to kind of schedule your stuff out pretty well to make sure that you were continually hitting those deadlines. And for them, they have to be a little bit more decisive in terms of the looks and the fields that they were kind of going for, just to make sure that we could complete it in the time frame that we had. But yeah, usually we have another 2 to 3 months to be able to kind of really fine tune stuff, which is really helpful for things like assets and everything to kind of do like a lot of the look dev. It's just that extra little time to be able to kind of work that in, and then the last couple months are usually just kind of taking everything that we've kind of created and trying to get it into shots so that they can
Yeah,
sort
yeah,
of
I
sequence.
got you. I got you. And so, like Black Widow, it's more of like I guess a practical sort of on the ground type movie, like like Jason Bourne esque type of movie. And then compare that to something like I saw that you worked on like Aquaman or like Justice League Independence Day. These kind of like more heavy CG or VFX movies. So how's the sort of process all differ when you're like depending on the kind of movie you're working on, whether it's heavy sci-fi or heavy like more this kind of action?
Yeah, so I mean, the one thing that's really great about a movie like this, like Black Widow, is the process is a little bit. I mean, the creative process tends to be a little bit more simpler because it's grounded to realism, and people kind of know what it needs to look like. And so, there's a lot of reference material and there's a lot of like good source material that we can use to kind of just understand what exactly it is that we're trying to accomplish. So, like the environment for the bridge sequence was actually based in Scotland and, or sorry, in Norway. No, sorry. The environment's in Scotland, and then the bridge was actually in Norway, and so we had like reference material that we could use to kind of build our environment off of. And it's kind of we just knew what it needed to look like. There was some stuff that we were kind of going through in terms of creative process with them to understand exactly what they were looking for the background, because we were kind of going a little bit more, stylized and a little bit more visual, so you can kind of see a lot of that environment in the background, since we built out about 10 kilometers of a real environment in 3D. And but then it kind of came back to let's bring this back into more of a realism than to have like more of the dramatic Disney-esque or sorry Marvel-esque type of kind of looks and feels that you tend to have in a lot of the Marvel movies. And so there was a bit of a creative process in that of going kind of back and forth in terms of what exactly that design would kind of be. Ultimately, they went with a more realism look, and so a lot of that environment kind of gets lost in the darkness because of how dark that actual sequence is. But usually, but it's nice because in like sequences like this and movies like this, you have a lot of reference material that you can go by. They have a really good understanding of exactly what they're looking for. So it does make the process of the creative process a little bit easier to kind of accomplish than, say, if you had something like Aquaman, where it's very, very stylized. And in that movie in particular, we did a lot of work trying to like make it feel as realistic as possible. But there was a lot of like, when you do that, especially with underwater like sequences, it becomes very muddy and it's hard to see distance in underwater. And they were wanting something that was like a lot different than that, because they wanted it to be more like they wanted more visibility underwater. And so we had to do a lot of creative thinking to try to figure out a way to create a very stylized look that you get everything visually underwater, but it's not like extremely fake looking as well. So there was a lot of back and forth, and there's a lot more back and forth with the client on a creative project than it is when you have something that's a little bit more real. And you have a client that knows exactly what they're looking for those type of environments or those type of scenes.
Yeah, yeah. I watched your reel beforehand, and it's just remarkable the things you guys can do, because you think it's all when you're watching the movie, it feels like they're shooting this on set. There's not that much VFX used, but I mean obviously with what you're doing with Taskmaster there is, but it just looks so freaking real. And like how I guess like what I'm trying to ask is like how did you sort of start to develop that like realistic feel, like make are you're composing these on the computer, but how do you like mesh it with like real practical the shots that they're actually taking? If that makes
Yeah,
any
so I
sense.
mean, it's it can be. It's a bit of a challenging process when they, like obviously the bridge and the fight sequence of the bridge, they filmed it on a set.
Yeah.
They built about, I think it was about a quarter of the actual bridge itself, and then we had to do an extension to that. So one of the most challenging things with that kind of stuff is, you have a real bridge that you're working with, which is nice because then, when you're doing an extension, you're just matching to what that is. But obviously there's dimensions based off of the real bridge that they were wanting it to be that we also had to go about. And sometimes they don't always quite align perfectly in terms of the dimensions. And And so there's a little bit of some finicky work that needs to be done to kind of create that. And, but you have real life, reference for a lot of this kind of work. And so it makes it very easy to kind of go back and forth. Like they went and they got some photography for the bridge and the environment so that, we can go back and forth and be like, okay, is this matching to what this is? And if it's not, then it's like, okay, well, what do we need to improve that? It's like, is it, we need to do some additional work in texturing? Is the model not quite right? So when you have all that type of reference material, it makes it a lot easier to kind of match it to what it needs to be, which helps with a lot of the realism for it. I think one of the most challenging things was obviously when it came to the environment and trying to make sure that we had the exposure of the environment corrected for the lighting. It was a bit of a challenge because obviously on set they have, the bridge where they have all the lighting that they want on the bridge, but then there's blue screens everywhere and they have lights hitting those blue screens. So those blue screens look like they're a lot brighter than what the actual exposure behind that would be. But one of the nicest things that they had done is they also did turn on, like they did some reference photography of the bridge, or like with Taskmaster and everybody on set, so that where they turned off all the blue screen lights. So you actually got the proper exposure of what would be behind them, and you can see how dark it would actually be. So that really kind of helped with us to determine like what would the exposure would be outside past that bridge. And one of the challenges with that though too is since it did end up being such kind of a dark scene, it's like, okay, well, how do you create, something that's interesting in the background? Because obviously if you turn off, like if your exposure is so low, you don't really see anything, and then it just becomes like just a dark environment where you don't see anything. And obviously people want to have detail and make things look a little bit more interesting. And so what we tended to do is we looked at areas where we could add lights from like, maybe some houses that were around the river, or if there was like just street lights from the roads and stuff like that, and where we could kind of strategically place them so that it just made for a little bit more of an interesting environment, and we could kind of light up some of that environment in some areas to allow it to be visible in shots from throughout the whole sequence.
I got you. And so, speaking on that fight, obviously it's early in the movie, and it's the one that more or less sets the movie in motion. But the Taskmaster reveal, I know like the suit doesn't really tip the hand at all, but when you're sort of working on, I guess, like, the background of that character, and then did you have to do anything in regard to like sort of hide her identity? Or was there any like visual cues that you tried to put into place where it became a little more misleading?
Actually, surprisingly, when they were filming, it wasn't the actual actor of Taskmaster that was actually doing it. It was they had basically a stand-in that was a male, so that it wouldn't give away the actual story plot line. So aside from seeing the movie early on, I had actually, while I was on set, we had no idea who Taskmaster actually was.
Gotcha.
So that was the interesting thing. But I think they found like an actor that had like roughly the same height and kind of build, so that once they were on set, like you wouldn't be able to really notice the difference in terms of height and everything.
Yeah.
So we actually didn't really even know, and so we didn't have to really do anything to hide the identity, because it was a completely different actor.
Oh, I got you. And I guess I saw that you also worked on Justice League, and when you're animating or when you're working on Black Widow, there's parts where you have to like be very intricate with Scarlet's face, she's also using a stunt double as well. And I know we had everyone knows what happened with Justice League and with Henry Cavill. So how long does it take to work on that kind of aspect of it, that element of it, where you're working on people's faces and trying to make it as authentic, as real as possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tedious process. It actually takes quite a bit of time. There's about 3 to 4 months of development of digidoubles, just to make sure that you get a high enough amount of detail into the characters themselves, so that when you render them out, they look as real as they possibly can, especially when it's up close. I think that when it comes to digidoubles, it's something that typically, I think nowadays you can get them to look pretty much identical to actual live action character themselves. But when it comes down to making it look real and something seems off, it's always like facial animation and features and quirks that a character tends to have that's really hard to replicate. And I feel like in the industry in general, it's still challenging to this day, and people still have issues with getting it right. Is just the facial expressions and features that you kind of get with a character. So there's also a lot of strategic planning with shots in terms of how to kind of possibly hide that kind of situation where it's if it's a fast moving camera or whatever the case may be, to kind of just help kind of make it so that it's you can't really tell the quirks and features of a specific character per se, but you get the look and feel of them as they kind of move throughout. So the other thing too, actually, that I think is a lot easier, since this is an action sequence where there's a lot of moving parts and everyone's moving. When it's a stunt double, we had a lot of good photography of Natasha's face that we were able to take and basically project on studio and kind of move with the the stunt double. One of those things that tends to be a little bit challenging, though, is a lot of times their features are quite a bit different. Whether it's their facial features or their hair features or just their torso, whatever the case may be, they try to match as close as they can. But obviously, there's a lot of times where there's a lot that is very different, and that's where I think it becomes kind of challenging to be able to, say, if the stunt double's facial structures are elongated in comparison or whatever the case may be, then you're kind of having to jerry rig images to kind of fit properly, or you're gonna have to do some modifications or adjustments to the stunt double to kind of make sure that the features will end up kind of matching the same as well. So I think that there's definitely shots that are a lot more challenging than others. I think there's a lot of times where you would probably watch a movie and you wouldn't actually even notice that it's a stunt double or a digi double in a lot of scenes. But then there's obviously the shots that are dead giveaways, like kind of what happened with Justice League.
Yeah. So, you've worked in plenty of roles. You've worked your way up into this role as the visual effects supervisor. Could you sort of maybe explain for you started out as a digital compositor, and now how's your role sort of evolved, sort of changed? Is it just more versus what you were doing before?
Yeah. So I mean, the role changes pretty drastically, and I was I started out in the industry as a compositor, and I was a compositor for how long was that now? I guess it was about 8 years. I was a compositor, and then after some time, I kind of got promoted to being a lead compositor, which you do a lot of help with look dev and kind of helping out with any troubleshooting any of the artists kind of have for a show. And then I kind of moved into comp supervising, which is more just supervisory roles of basically making sure that everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing. You collaborate a lot with production in terms of schedules and time frame of when we would be getting things accomplished, and then just a lot of reviewing shots and giving creative input based off of the information that you have, and then going into a lot of reviews with the visual effects supervisor of the show, and kind of just getting feedback from them and brainstorming for shots and sequences to see what we can do to improve things, or what other options we might have if something's not quite working, or just kind of getting into it and being this looks great, and let's kind of make this the feel of the sequence and try to roll it out for the rest of the shots. And then on actually the Joker, I got my first VFX supervisor role here at Scanline. And yeah, I mean, it's a lot more different in terms of what you're doing day to day. When you're the VFX supervisor, it's a lot of reviewing, a lot of meetings with a lot of all different departments, because obviously you're now, instead of just being involved in one department, you're involved with multiple departments, every department for the show, and trying to make sure that everything gets out. And so it's a lot of reviewing, meetings, and then working very closely with the producer on scheduling, not artists we need. And then, you do a lot of client interaction. So, obviously, all the client meetings and stuff like that, making sure that we get the direction that we're needing from them, and just getting them the look and feel of what they're trying to accomplish. And so it changes from being the artist and doing a lot of the creative work yourself to more, directing people for in the right direction of what exactly the creative look is that the client's trying to accomplish. So it does change quite a bit because, obviously when you're out of the box and you're working, you're used to trying to develop that yourself, and you have ideas in your brain, and you kind of put them to work on the machine, and then or on the box, and then as a supervisor, you're having to more tell people what you're looking for, and you're having to direct them in whatever direction you need to go. So you get a little bit less. You're a little bit less involved in terms of like physically doing the work, and more just kind of directing people on how to or what to do for it.
I got you. And so, like, because what you do is something that I know I could never do, just because I don't have. I mean, the technical skills are just on another level. And also, I wanted to say, like, I loved your work on Joker because I've seen a reel for that, and it's one of the best Gothams I think that you guys sort of create.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
And so, no, it's absolutely fantastic. And so, like when you're doing this, when you're meeting with clients and stuff, I know sometimes you have a rushed window, like, and some, you hear the rumors about Justice League, Dark Phoenix, and that kind of stuff. But then, like, stuff like Aquaman and Black Widow, I know you've worked on Suicide Squad and all that stuff, and like, you rarely can you fault the VFX for, like, if you give them time and like money, like you can do pretty much anything that you could think of. So, like, when you're meeting with a client, what's like the kind of criteria they have to check off where you're like, I can do this project, or like how's your whole wheels turn when they present a project to you?
I mean, usually I would say that a majority of the time, like, the scope of work is usually not a whole lot different. I mean, there's different categories that you have. Like, there's things like Black Widow where it's like, a bit of a smaller sequence, and it's not as effects heavy or creatively heavy. It's more of like, this is what it needs to look like, this is what we want to do. So it's a little bit more. It's a little bit easier to understand exactly what we need to do to accomplish it. But then there's obviously movies like Suicide Squad or Aquaman or Justice League stuff where there's a lot more creativity that's involved in trying to figure out what all this design work would look like. So there's a lot of times like you basically bid on projects based off of the information that you get from the client, as they go into production, and so you have a bit of like a rough understanding of exactly what it is that you'll be doing, and then a lot of times once you're approved to work on the show and you kind of move forward with it, you get a lot of you start getting plates, and you start to see exactly what they did in filming, and you start to really understand where they were looking for. And a lot of it also comes from like concept art that you get from the client, so they give you a rough idea of exactly what they want. A lot of times that changes, but there's a lot of times where directors and stuff, they want to stick exactly with what they got produced with their concept art. And so I think that relatively everything kind of fits under one certain category, whether it's like very simplistic design or like just realism, or it's like, okay, we have this really crazy creative effect that we want to do, or we need to do water, et cetera, et cetera. And based off of our knowledge from previous shows and everything, we have a pretty good idea of like roughly how much it's going to take and how long it's going to take. And so that kind of gives us a good idea of whether or not we can, if we should take a project or not to be able to work on it. And we just we go off of that process. It's pretty rare. I mean, with enough, you're right, like with enough time and, effort, like pretty much anything's like possible when it comes to visual effects. It's just a matter of, when it comes down to it, it's usually a matter of time. I mean, if it's something that's extremely creative and arbitrary, where they don't know exactly what they're looking for, but they have a rough idea, but they want us to create a look and feel. A lot of times that's going to take a lot longer than it would if it was something where they're like, yeah, so we have this environment, this is where it takes place, this is exactly what it needs to look like, we just need you to build it. That becomes a lot easier because you already have a good idea of exactly what they're looking for. So it can be a tedious process to kind of understand it and go through it, and sometimes it takes more time. That's why sometimes you have development time where you'll be on a project for a year, maybe even 2 years, and then there's other ones that are like 6 to 8 months, and it kind of just depends on the scope of work that they're looking for.
Gotcha. And I don't want to keep you too long, so I just have two more. But on this one, when you're working on something, obviously you know a lot about the movie before it ever comes out. Has that ever ruined your experience? Like, I know you're working. I think I see that you're working on Cowboy Bebop as well. And does it ever sort of ruin your experience when you actually watch the project, like when it's all finished, or does it not really? Like by now, does it not really affect you at all?
It's funny. It actually it doesn't really ruin it for me. There's a lot of times where I try to avoid knowing more than I need to about a project, simply just so that I can hopefully enjoy it when it comes out. But I think that when you're working on something, you get a feeling of like, is this going to be like a really cool movie, or is this going to be something that isn't quite the style or like preference of a type of movie that you might enjoy? And there's a lot of times where you might feel like, I don't know about this movie for me personally. Then you go and watch and you're like, oh, this is way better than I was actually like. I enjoyed this. I shouldn't say it's way better, but it's just I enjoyed this a lot more than I had previously expected to, based off of what I was kind of seeing and understanding of what it was. But a lot of times with the way that I kind of approach it, with trying to avoid as much information as I can, a lot of times you're seeing things out of context, and so it's harder to really judge or understand what exactly it is until you actually see it cut together. And actually in the movie, because a lot of times there's like backstory or whatever the case may be that kind of leads up to what you were working on, that just helps understand exactly what it is that it is in that sequence.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess that's the right way to approach it. And so, I know I've made small films and editing and all that stuff, final cut and all that. Nothing on the scale that you're working on, but as like the perfectionist in you, when you see like a shot that you've worked on, like when you see it in the theaters and you're like, oh, we missed something, or we could have done that better. Do those kind of thoughts ever come across you?
Yeah, I mean, you get that from time to time. Like there is those kind of instances where that happens, but honestly, I feel like a lot of times when you see stuff that doesn't quite look right, or you feel like, oh man, this could have been much more improved, or we could have done a better job on this. It all comes down to a lot of factors within the process of making the movie, whether it's time or direction, or just ideas that were just really difficult to create with the content that we had, or whatever the case may be. So it's hard to kind of sit there and be like, oh man, we could have definitely done a better job on this, or we really missed that, because there's a lot of times where there's reasons why that actually transpires. But I would say there has been a few times where we've gone to the theater and watched a movie and been like, yeah, we really kind of could have done a better job on that one, or we might have missed that one. It's unfortunate, but it is a part of the industry, and I think that with the amount of visual effects that are in movies today, there's always going to be shots and sequences where you're like, yeah, that could have just been better, whether it comes from like the design of the shot or to just what we did, at the studio. There's always shots that you're going to look at and be like, yeah, I wish we could have like improved on that one a bit more. But you never can really kind of sit there and dwell on it too much, because it is what it is, and you just learn from the mistakes of the past, and you hopefully improve it for the next ones.
Gotcha. Well, awesome. Sorry, I just thought of one thing, but as a VFX supervisor now, like, what's the one bit of thing that you could tell? Like, I mean, everyone sort of wants to make films. It's always been sort of thing I've always wanted to pursue. But like when you're working with directors, producers, it's like, what's the one thing that you wish like aspiring filmmakers knew about how to work with VFX supervisors, and so the process can be as seamless as possible?
That is a really good question. It's hard because obviously it's a really difficult situation, because a lot of times, like, you know, on set, you know, there's a lot of times where you'll kind of have like a scene where they're filming it, and then you get the plates and you realize like they have a bunch of stuff all over the scene. They don't have proper blue screens in certain areas. There's lights that are like going over a character's hair, which makes it really difficult, like a real challenge to like, you know, extract that character and put something in the background, especially when it comes to that kind of thing. And those are the type of things that, you know, when you're doing the work and, you know, you're sitting in front of a box and you only get the plates, you kind of feel like, man, I really wish that they would have kind of spent a little bit more time thinking about this, or like, you know, removing this stuff, because it would just make life a lot easier for us. But then when you go on set and you do a lot of this stuff, you come to the realization that it's like a lot of times there's a lot of moving parts on set, and there's like a very limited amount of time that you have to shoot things, especially when it's like things that are outdoors and lighting from, you know, the sun or whatever the case may be, are a big factor. That you just don't have time sometimes to be able to do those kind of things that you're looking for, whether it's like, you know, putting up another blue screen, or removing objects that shouldn't be there. And or like, you know, there's also times where it's like, well, the light's there for a reason. They're looking at have like a specific feel they're trying to get for that exact shot, and so they can't remove that light. You can't block it, because otherwise it won't get the same lighting effect as what they're expecting. So you know, as much as like when you're just looking at stuff and you're sitting at a box and working on it, you wish they would actually kind of spend a little bit more time trying to make sure that the scene is set up in a way that makes it a little bit easier to kind of accomplish on our side. Once you're on set and you start going through the process of like how they do this kind of stuff, you realize that there's a lot of times there's reasons why it is what it is, and you can't really fault them for it.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate this. This was fantastic. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you doing the interview, and it was really nice meeting you.
It was nice meeting you too, man. Have a good one.
You too. Thanks.